what's up everybody? It's been a while, but I'm finally back with another video, and today, as you can see, yeah, ASUS finally sent me this brand spanking new ROG 4080 to check out and compare it to something like a 3090, because I had to send the 4090 back, and maybe I'll get another 4090 soon, so I can compare that to 4080 and stuff like that. But at the moment we're gonna be checking out how the 4080 performs and how it performs versus something like the 3090, which I'm still using in my main PC. So should be pretty interesting results here, because I also updated my benchmarking PC from an AMD Ryzen 7700X to a Intel Core i9-13900K. So there should be no restrictions on, you know, graphical power here. And anyway, I did check out the prices as well, right? On Amazon, I did find that this card goes around $1,500 versus the 4090, the ROG 4090, that goes around $2,000. Now you might get it a little bit cheaper or maybe a little bit more expensive, but those are the price ranges. So expect to pay like 500 bucks more for the 4090 than the 4080. So the question is the 4080 worth your money if you're gonna play on 4K? So that's the video setup here for today. If you're interested, stick around. Anyway, first of all, the overall build quality, I mean, it definitely lives up to the hype here for ASUS stuff. It is a technical marvel for sure, with its absolutely beautiful die-cast backplate and a humongous 3.5 slot vapor chamber designed cooling solution that houses 3 gigantic ASUS Axial Deck fans that turn completely off when the card's temperatures fall below 50 to 55 degrees Celsius. It's pretty amazing once again from Team ASUS. Now I'm gonna talk about the maximum temperatures that the card reached in the benchmarking section, but yeah, overall it's an amazing card, you know, very well built, has an amazing cooling solution, and this cooling solution is whisper quiet even while gaming. And that's even more impressive when you actually see what the maximum temperatures of the card actually were when playing video games. But I did do a COIL WHINE test for you guys as well. So yeah, a lot of people out there still kinda, you know, are a little bit annoyed when, you know, when you start playing video games and the frame rate goes really high, the video card coils start to whine, right? So how loud is the coil whine on this card? I did a small little test, so check it out right here. Alright, so this is the ROG 4080 here in Far Cry 6, and I have to be on the video adapter tab here to get the greatest coil whine noise, but I'm gonna stop the CPU fans for a second so you can actually hear what's going on through this microphone. Let me move the mouse. Alright, so as you can hear, the coil whine is a little bit, it's a little bit loud, right? So maybe Team ASUS could look into this to improve this on future video cards, but this has been an issue for most video cards out there since, like, I don't know, like 2006 or 8 or something like that. When it, you know, when I actually first started hearing stuff like that. But it never really bothers me while playing video games, so yeah. I mean, I'm pretty used to it, and if I don't play video games, there's no coil whine at all, so that's pretty fine in my opinion. Now moving on to some other stuff like RGB and the design choice overall. I mean, I do like the design. The only thing that I didn't really like is the color design on the black card. There's some like blue and red colors put on the card, and I don't know. I don't really like the color scheme of that on a black card. Maybe just, you know, add a few extra LED strips. Because the ASUS Aura Sync RGB system here is pretty neat, it's pretty interesting. The entire back side of the card is in RGB, and you can configure it in the Aura Sync or in the Armory great software that ASUS has, and yeah, it's pretty fine. Now you do find 2 extra fan connect sockets on the back side of the card, so you can actually hook 2 fans into the card to help cool itself down a lot better via 2 extra 120mm or whatever fans you put into those sockets, right? So that's pretty neat. But anyway, it's time to actually move into the benchmarking section now and see how good the 4080 actually is, the ROG 4080, and we're gonna compare it to the ROG 3090, so should be pretty interesting. Now all the benchmarks that I'm gonna show here are ran at most maximum detail with no anti-aliasing at 4K settings. Now some games, for whatever reason, do not let you actually disable anti-aliasing. Like, why? So for those reasons, those games are just running anti-aliasing at the lowest setting possible. But anyway, I don't think I mentioned exact specifications of my new benchmarking PC. It is a Intel Core i9 13900K running at 5.5 GHz, which is more than enough for most games out there. It is pretty much the most powerful CPU on the market right now for gaming, and I'm using 32 GB of 7200 MHz DDR5 memory. On top of that, I'm running Windows 11 on the 1TB M.2 SSD. And yeah, if you're wondering what drivers I'm running the 526.98 nVidia drivers for both of these cards. So yeah, that's the whole setup here. So beginning things off with 3D marks, right? The first 3D mark that I ran through was 3D mark TIMESPY Extreme, and the 3090, the RTX 3090 scored a pretty decent score of 10,393 points. While the ROG RTX 4080 scored 13,765 points. That's a pretty decent 30% or so improvement, so pretty nice. Next up was 3D Mark Port Royale with cheese, or was it a quarter pounder? Anyway, the 3090 got 13,521 points, while the 4080 received 18,258 points. Again, a pretty nice gain over the 3090, and that's gonna conclude the 3D marks here. Next up, I moved to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and running through the 3090 at 4K maximum detail, it got a score of 92 frames per second. Pretty nice at 4K. So what about the 4080? Well, 122 frames per second. Interesting. Again, around about 30% faster than the 3090. Now, next up was Far Cry 6 4K max detail without ray tracing, and the 3090 scored a total of 87 frames per second. Pretty good, well over 60 frames per second, but a bit low for 120 Hz screens, right? Well, running the same test on the 4080 scored 116 frames per second. That's pretty nice, because you can always go into the graphical settings, tweak a few settings to a little bit lower detail, and I'm pretty sure you can hit 120 frames per second plus constantly with the 4080. So you can fully utilize your 120 Hz screen, which is pretty amazing. But I did not stop there with Far Cry 6, because Far Cry 6 also offers ray tracing support, and that's what I did. I enabled ray tracing on the most maximum settings, 4K detail, and the 3090 got a score of 74 frames per second, and the 4080 99 frames per second. Both cards actually holding up pretty good with ray tracing turned on, but I was expecting the 4000 series card to do a little bit better here with ray tracing turned on. Anyway, moving on to Grand Theft Auto 5 max settings, even in the advanced graphics, and the 3090 scored a pretty nice score of 140 frames per second as average for the fourth and the longest pass of the benchmark. The 4080 on the other hand got a result of 157 frames per second. Not a huge difference here, but more likely a CPU bottleneck even at 4K. So next up was Cyberpunk 2077, and this game has had its problems even in the benchmarking world. So previously when I did my 4090 benchmarks, a lot of people were like leaving me comments, oh my god, your benchmarking stuff is so wrong, you don't know how to benchmark and stuff like that, and it was really frustrating because actually, you know, Cyberpunk 2077 was buggy. Surprise, right? But yeah, even the settings that you set in the settings, most people just use the quick slider, right, the presets, right, and then ran the benchmarks. That actually didn't really, you know, enable anything. So some benchmarkers there had like double or even triple the frame rate than it actually should have had. But my benchmarks were actually totally fine, especially if you compared that I had a Ryzen 7 7700X. So this is the reason why I'm still gonna run the Cyberpunk 2077 benchmarks, because they seem totally fine, and the scores are totally fine on the 13900K as well, in my opinion. So let's begin with the benchmarks, right? 4K resolution, maximum detail, and first of all, without ray tracing, without DLSS, the 3090 got a score of 30.3 frames per second on the 13900K. While the 4080 got 38.1. Might not seem like a lot, but if we look at other games and 3D marks I benched, the result is about the same, around 30% faster. Now, I enabled ray tracing, and the 3090 got an average of 20.5 frames per second, and the 4080 at 29 frames per second. So even without DLSS turned on, you know, native 4K resolution, you still hit around 30, like barely 30 at the maximum detail. So if you tweak a few settings, you can definitely get 30 frames per second, which is like, you know, previous generation console enjoyment, right? On the controller, that's perfectly fine, but for a keyboard and mouse, 30 frames per second is just, it's too slow, right? But what happens if we turn on DLSS, right? So that's what I did next. Turned on DLSS and left ray tracing on as well. So most max detail also and 4K resolution. The 3090 got a score of 84 frames per second, and the 4080 a whopping 117 frames per second. That's a pretty nice result, and mostly I think it might be something to do with the brand new ray tracing cores, right, for the 4000 series cards. So when you enable ray tracing, it doesn't hit the performance that hard as it did earlier with the 3000 or 2000 series, right? So yeah, tweak a few settings here and you can get 120 frames per second plus while ray tracing is turned on. But of course with DLSS, so it's not really actually native 4K, but it does a better job than just hitting the upscale button or upscale your resolution, right? So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. But I did want to do one more test. What happens if you disable the ray tracing, right, and just leave the DLSS option enabled on maximum settings, 4K resolution? Let's run it. Let's see what frames we get, right? So ultra performance, right? So the 3090 got 128 frames per second. I think, and the 4080 got a score of 167 frames per second. Now, there is a small mishap that happened here, was that I lost the benchmarking result for the 3090 and I couldn't run it again because my water cooling system died. I don't know why. It might be to do something because the 4080 was so big and I had to take out the water cooling, all-in-one water cooling solution, put it on top of the case, and I don't think it liked it that much. Although I did manage to run through both tests, right, both 4080, both 3090, and when I noticed my fault here, I was like, okay, I'm gonna take out the 3090, put it into the benchmarking PC, run the test again, no problems, and the pump actually died. Like it went great, like 10,000 RPM. And after I saw 10,000 RPM and 90 degrees on my CPU in BIOS, I shut down the PC, and when I tried to turn it back on, the pump would not turn on. So right now I'm living without a pump at the moment for the CPU, so I need to wait for a new cooling solution for my benchmarking PC. And this is the reason why I actually don't like all-in-one water cooling solutions, or water cooling solutions in general. The pumps are too loud for my ears anyway. But for benchmarking I don't really care, right? But yeah, they can die if you mishandle the radiator, right? The pump needs to pump water and there's all sorts of stuff that can happen. So yeah, I thought I'd explain what happened here. But this is the only test that I actually, mistakenly wrote the 4080 result for the 3090 and only for the DLSS test here. Anyway, moving on to the next game. The next game that I benchmarked was Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 Warzone 2.0. So by turning everything to the maximum detail, SMAA to T2X low detail, and going to a precise spot on the battlefield, the battlefield, yep. The 3090 scored an average frame rate of 70 frames per second, while the 4080 managed to eke out around 100 to 103 frames per second as average. Turn down a couple of settings here and you can definitely get like 120 frames per second plus for the 4080. So a pretty nice boost in performance once again here. And yeah, definitely the 4080 holding up pretty good versus the 3090. Now quickly moving on to a video game that is near and dear to my heart, that is Path of Exile. And I did check out how does it perform in a system like this, right? If you buy a brand spanking new 13900K, right, with proper 32 gigabytes of DDR5 memory, running on an SSD, and is there a big difference versus a 3090 versus a 4080, and all of these setups combined? I'm gonna run a delirious map as well, 100% delirious map. So does the frame rate still dip to 30 frames per second or lower? That's what we're gonna find out in this video. So for Path of Exile, I've figured out two ways to check the performance. So one is in my hideout, which is pretty massively detailed, and I'm gonna take the average frame rate from there, and then I'm gonna move to a random delve node, and I'm gonna take the frame rate from there. So that's what we're gonna be comparing here. So first of all, 4K resolution, most maximum detail with dynamic resolution and culling turned off. The 3090 got an average frame rate of 85 frames per second in my hideout and 127 frames per second in delve. Switching things over to the 4080, in my hideout it got 122 frames per second, and in delve it got 180 frames per second. So after I did those benchmarks, I did want to see what happens if I turn the settings down to something that I use usually when playing Path of Exile. That is, everything turned to the lowest detail, even if I have the best PC in the world. because that's what you have to do, right? So I turned down all the settings, right? Turned everything to the lowest settings, even all the anisotropic filtering stuff, and I enabled dynamic resolution and culling also enabled, and 4K resolution still. So then in my hideout, the 3090 got 141 frames per second, and moving into Delve, it got a whopping 301 frames per second. That's pretty nutty. So how about the 4080? Well, in my hideout, it got 205 frames per second, and in Delve, almost 400 at 395 frames per second. That's freaking insane. Very, very buttery, smooth gameplay. Although, you know, when I actually play the video game, I do use anisotropic filtering, and I also use high detail texture settings when I actually play the game, right? But it's pretty much the lowest detail. But I try to, you know, at least use high resolution textures. But anyway, I did open up a T16 map, 100% delirious, with sextants, with scarabs, right? And just wanted to see, does the frame rate still dip to really low levels, right? So I didn't bother with the 3090 really, just put in the 4080 and yeah, went into a pretty delirious map, right? And the frame rate still dipped to 30s, there's like no difference. And the most horrible part, it started crashing. Crashing to the desktop. But this might be to do something with DirectX, not DirectX, but all the benchmarks were ran at DirectX 12, but what I think here happened was Windows 11, because I still use Windows 10, and I think the crashing is something to do with Windows 11 and Path of Exile. So yeah, I couldn't actually finish the delirious maps because yeah, the system wanted me to crash into the desktop. But anyway, those were the benchmarks for today's benchmarking session here, and I still have a couple of things here. First of all, I do want to get Forza Horizon 5 and add that benchmark here in future tests, but what about the maximum temperature, right? The maximum temperature for the 4080 was 64 degrees, and it never really got loud. The only thing that got loud was my CPU fans. But yeah, the card was pretty whisper quiet, and 64 degrees was the maximum temperatures after I ran all these benchmarks. That was pretty freaking insane in my opinion. So as you can see, this 4080 is a pretty well built beast, and definitely, I mean, it's like $500 difference versus the 4090, right? And definitely if you wanna save $500, why not, right? You're definitely gonna get lower frame rates in 4K, but you know, you have to consider, is $500 for you worth it or not, right? For $500 you can buy a no, you can't even buy a good CPU. But you can buy something, right? So $500 is definitely nothing to, you know, throw away, right? And other stuff, you know, the 4000 series having all the brand spanking new ray tracing cores and the DLSS, brand new DLSS system. So there's a lot to love on the 4000 series in general, and ASUS has done a pretty magnificent job on the 4080. So my final verdict for the ROG STRIX Gaming GeForce RTX 4080 is going to be a 9.5 out of 10. I mean, it's a pretty magnificent card and almost deserves 10 out of 10 in my opinion. But the only downside is it is a little bit too big. The blue and red lines here, I don't know, I don't like that a lot. But does it, you know, take away points from a score? Not really, right? But it is really gigantic, and this is a little bit of an issue, because it didn't really fit in my case. I needed to remove my water cooling solution and it actually broke, right? So yeah, kind of disappointed about that, but of course I maybe could have, you know, just bought a bigger case for my benchmarking PC, so I need to do that as well. But yeah, if you count that the actual PCB of the 4080 is like this big, but the card is this big, and the maximum temperatures are like 64. So why do we need such a huge cooler? Bring it down a bit, leave the maximum temperatures at 75, maybe 80 degrees maximum, right, when playing video games. But if the card can be like half of this size, it's, in my opinion, a no-brainer. So yeah, that's about that. Damn, this makes me feel it's a 9.9 out of 10 card. Nah, I'm gonna still leave it 9.5 because pretty much no one actually made a card smaller than they are. All of the 4080s, all of the 4090s from different manufacturers are just absolute units of video cards, right? Anyway, that's gonna conclude my quick little review from this card. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you liked it, leave a thumbs up, maybe subscribe, and if you have any questions, leave them down below in the comment section. So that's gonna be it. Thanks for watching. Ciao for now.